All right, welcome everyone. My name is Russ Sabella. I'm past president of the Florida School Counselor Association. I'd like to introduce a dear colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Madelyn, who's professor and chair of the Department of Counseling here at Florida Gulf Coast University. She'll be talking about advocacy. And before we get started, just a couple of notes. One is that we are recording this, and so we'll have a replay ready for you as soon as possible. We'll also have handouts and PowerPoints up online available for you to download, so don't worry about that part. And then third, we'll be monitoring the questions area of the GoToWebinar platform. So if you have some questions, go ahead and type them in the questions area. We may not be able to get to them right away, but we will make some time for question and answer. So without further ado, Dr. Madelyn.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with me and to find out something about advocacy. I've been engaged in advocacy activities both for the Florida Counseling Association years ago and now for the Florida School Counseling Association for a long time. It's something that I enjoy doing and I think is very productive when you can empower people to begin to advocate. So just to think about it, no matter what we do with advocacy, it's never about an individual counselor. It's not about saving jobs. It's about student achievement. And every time we can have an active, good conversation about student achievement, using data and having focused arguments on student achievement, we will be successful advocates. So the definition of advocacy that you'll see variously has to do with removing barriers to success, either because there's a lack of support or resources or training or ratios or appropriate curriculum or equity or a lack of understanding of the problem or possibilities or a lack of accountability and evaluation. Those all have been identified as barriers to success in student achievement and in advocacy. So the areas where we might think about advocating, either on a school level, a district level, or a legislative level, a policy, an upper policy level, has to do with students or has to do with advocating for yourself by advocating for the profession. With students, often we're looking at school safety issues, and you can only read in the news that school counselors have become involved in issues with regard to gun violence and student violence and bullying, and the impact that that has on individuals and schools and communities, for achievement, for access and equity, for placement in challenging courses, or for encouragement for challenging aspirations. On the professional and self level, we often see counselors advocating for sufficient numbers of counselors to do the job so that students can have access and equity for their aspirations and for achievement. To perform job-appropriate tasks, to have sufficient resources behind them, whether those be partnerships or time, space, professional development or training, recognition for what they do. Those are areas for advocacy. And you will see that FSCA and many states around the country have had professional advocacy efforts at the state level for just these kinds of issues. Sometimes when it comes to students, we're advocating for a single student to make sure that they're getting what they need, or that their family is getting a fair shake and access to what they're entitled to in the school system. Sometimes it's for a particular group of students, multicultural competencies as a means for addressing discrimination or policies or placements. Or it's advocating for all students, better counseling programs, better schools, more and effective community resources, aspects of a pupil progression plan that may make it more accessible for students to achieve success and finish school or stay in school. And for students, we also need to advocate for the profession. So we promote the school counseling profession, so we're empowered to do what we know how to do, and that we're recognized for doing it well because we can prove that it works. That goes back to removing barriers to student achievement. Everything always will circle back to student achievement. When you think about the American School Counseling Association Goals and Objectives and the FSCA Goals and Objectives, and these haven't changed all that much over the years. You're looking at things like legislative policy, strategic partnerships, having leadership and champions, professional development, accountability, and access to supports so that we can advocate appropriately for student success. Advocacy is also an ethical obligation, and starting about 20 years ago, it has been increasingly creeping into the language of our code of ethics and the way we look at our obligations to the profession and to students. It's very much a part of the national model. In the beginning, in the preamble, we're obligated by our ethics to act in the best interests of the client and to do good, and we keep going from there to our obligations for leadership and for change that have been enshrined in the national model. And you can see where advocacy is in the ethical standards throughout, whether it be the preamble, in our curriculum, in our collaboration and data-driven accountability models that we use. The FSCA Advocacy platform, which you can get detailed on the FSCA website, really just talks about addressing the needs of all students, promoting professional excellence, and trying to close the gap of achievement that exists for groups of students in the state. So this is all about achievement again, and that's where our advocacy generates from. So if advocacy is about tearing down barriers, the way that we can put that into some kind of an operational term is to identify unmet needs and take actions to change the circumstances that continue to contribute or further the problem or the inequity. So sometimes it's removing a barrier, changing something actively. Sometimes it's promoting something or promoting the availability and accessibility for school counseling on various levels. Sometimes it's facilitating change. And as counselors, we're in the change business. Years ago, they coined us as the change agent people, and while we may not use that language all that much anymore, we still are the change agent people. We manage change, and we manage resistance to it. So our job at the policy level is to ensure that funding and policy decisions are made that support school counseling programs and school counselors so they are adequately there and able to support student achievement. So advocacy really is about skills and dispositions for school counselors. There's a portion of it that requires leadership, good communication, a degree of courage, because there's risk-taking involved in this, collaboration, persistence, because most of us know that real policy change, certainly at the state or even at the district level, does not occur in a heartbeat. It takes time, it takes events, it takes a lot of people working together to make things happen. It takes your coordination skills, and it takes a bent towards altruism. People who engage in advocacy are not necessarily doing it because it immediately impacts their individual good. They do it because it impacts the greater good or the good for one of their clients. So we use the skills of counseling, our collaboration skills, our systemic change skills, our communication skills, and our leadership skills to do this. So how do you know when you're advocating? What kinds of things are you doing already every day that tells us you're advocating? Well, you're advocating when you're promoting our credibility in the public's eye, when you're appearing at meetings, when you speak to a parent group, when you do professional development or community development to promote your program or teach parents or teachers how to better support student achievement using the skills that we have. When you're generating or promoting the research on the efficacy of counseling. When you're telling people, we know how to do this, we know it works, we have research, we've tried it in our school, we have accountability issues. We've been effective in impacting the outcomes for this group of students or for this particular issue and policy. We've been a part of good change. You know you're advocating when you're telling people what their policy agenda should include to the benefit of students. When you're forming coalitions, when you're collaborating with families, to make sure that students are accessing the things to which they're eligible or which will help them. When you're collaborating with your state DOE, or with your local board, or even your unions, to ensure that school counseling effectiveness is being considered and being promoted. There's a vicious cycle that goes on with advocacy that I've listened to counselors tell me about a lot. And it's a tough place to break in. You can't advocate for students if you have too many students to be effective, or if your non-counseling duties become a barrier to effective implementation, if you lack professional development, if you lack representation in the reform discussions and the school improvement discussions in your school, or you don't have a job because there's been policy changes or funding changes or legislative priorities that aren't really being informed by counseling research and outcomes. On the other hand, it's like a chicken and an egg. You have to advocate to be able to advocate more effectively. So to be in a position to advocate for your students, you have to ensure that you've advocated for your profession, that people know what you're capable of doing, that they set boundaries that are reasonable about the work that you do so that you can do more of it. It isn't about you personally, it's about policies and outcomes that make school a better place for kids. So if you think about a solution-focused approach to this, how is your vision or goal happening just a little bit? Even if you've got too many students to feel that you're really getting ahead on so many of the goals that you may have set, what are you doing a little bit that you would like to do more of with more students, with more time, with more support that would get you closer and closer to your goal? So if you can identify the thing you're doing a little bit that's good, that's what you want to promote, build data around, and use as an advocacy platform from which you can begin to get to do more of it, to do more of the things that you know will be effective. The challenges for school counseling often is that we can't get out of our own way. We don't often overcome our own barriers. We tend towards helping in conformity and compromise much more than assertive autonomy, taking risks, and engaging in objective analysis. We're the heartstrings people. We went into this because for the most part, we're heartstrings people. And in order to become an effective advocate, you have to remain a heartstrings person with an engine of objective analysis and autonomy and assertive persistence to get where you need to go. You know, like all new educators, we've done many studies on this. Educators and new school counselors are no exception, will be more obedient and conforming than independent. So what they're going to do is fit into the culture of the school, which may not be very friendly to school counseling and to the policies that will promote school counseling. So we have to be very mindful as we induct new people into the profession and as we begin to enter the profession if you're fairly new in the profession. School counselors are often not bent towards working and presenting data, although I think we're more and more requiring that as part of school counseling training and development for pre-service counselors as well as for people who are out in the field. Sometimes they have trouble balancing the collaborative relationships and being assertive and compromising and self-confident, all at the same time. Many districts and many schools do not promote autonomy and assertive advocacy. They want compliance, and they want people who are going to follow their rules and follow what they're suggesting. So there is some challenge that school counselors have to recognize and work through before they just jump in with both feet to becoming effective advocates. So part of what we're talking about with advocacy is having a goal, having a picture, your best picture of what will happen if you do something different. At the same time, you also need to look at the vision of what will happen if we don't do something different. One of the things I've learned in working with legislators and policymakers very clearly is to learn how to say to them, if we do more of this, then you can expect school improvement to go up, school climate to improve, school safety to improve, bullying to go down, more students attending school because they're not afraid, less school violence, whatever that particular picture might be. But you also have to say, if we don't do more of what we're doing, you're going to get more of the same or worse. And we also have to have the data that shows what the present state is and why it needs to change. So a lot of advocacy is developing a story, telling people what it is you want to be doing, what the problem is, and how you can solve it. So what percentage of your students are or are not graduating on time? How is that off your target? How is that holding your school back? How is that interfering with being a more effective district? What are the common barriers among students who have not completed on time, including, two of whatever? Give us a couple of things we can focus on. Not everything. We know everything is multifaceted and that no single phenomenon that we observe comes from a single source. But what are two of the common things that you think you can attack? Here's a story. X percentage of our students haven't graduated on time. Common barriers among the students who didn't complete were that they had a history of changing schools frequently, 2 or more times in the last 3 years, and they had a failure of at least one math class in the first 2 years of school. And when we've identified students who share those characteristics, we can intervene in this following way. In this example, we can intervene with junior students to identify those students who have failed. We can employ research-based intervention for this group that includes small groups, mentors, and after-school tutoring. To accomplish this, we're going to need an additional 20 school counselors hours per week to do it. That could be one person working exclusively on this for 20 hours a week. It may be, since this is a high school where there are more counselors, we need to capture 5 more hours, work hours, day hours a week for the 4 people working in our department. Okay? If we can do this, we have reason to believe, based on research and based on some preliminary work we've done to date, that we can increase graduation by X percentage each year. Would that give us a half-time school counselor? Would that give us fewer duties that are taking away from this? That's what we need to advocate for. If we don't intervene, if we don't find these 20 hours, we don't have any more hours in the day than we already have. We don't have any more staff. So if we don't intervene, our school will continue to fail to meet graduation rate targets, which impacts teacher allocations, school grades, rating systems, teacher raises, principal bonuses, however you need to lay that out. So you need to use credible data. Put the facts behind the face of a personal story and an anecdote. Here's the data in general. Let me tell you the story of one student. Let me tell you the story of young Russ Sabella, who came into our school after having been in 3 middle schools and 1 high school prior to coming here as a sophomore. Young Russ Sabella also failed his 9th grade math class, and therefore he was repeating it as a sophomore when he came here. We believe, because we've worked with young Russ Sabella in this way, that we can make this change for more students than just young Russ Sabella. So you're giving them data for the group. You're telling them what's going to happen. You're telling them what happens if you don't make change. And you're talking about how this can work. Okay? Where else has it worked? Look at the research. Look at the data. So here we go again. Develop an anecdote. Collect these anecdotes. Do it in a generalized way. Know who you're talking about. Don't make people up. Talk about real people. So advocacy is going to be a good story based on good data. You're going to want to identify gaps in services, procedures, and policies. You're going to want to set and create appropriate goals, targets for your advocacy. It's not an appropriate goal to say our department would be generally more effective with students. We'd get to see more students if we had 3 more counselors. It is reasonable to go ahead and say to people, yes, our department will do better if we have 20 more school counselor hours to work with this targeted group of students? You can create a sense of urgency with that. You can you can also engage stakeholders. Excuse me, I just have to mute this. Advocacy is based on good data because you can prove success. You can predict what's going to happen. Not what you hope will happen, but what you can predict happen because it's based on prior data. It allows you to be more persuasive. It takes emotion out of the equation. Counselors very often are used to talking in the affective domain, and therefore they're used to challenging policies and practices. We want to serve as a catalyst for focused action, not generalized action. So we never go in for just a generalized goal. We want more counselors. We want to do less of X. We want to tell people what we're going to be doing instead. If I get to do less lunchroom duty, what am I going to be using that time for, and how is that time going to contribute to a focused goal? So the types of data that can help you are what we call results data. How are students going to be different because of the school counseling program or my specific intervention? Or how will things stay the same or get worse because we don't make the change that we're asking for? And again, both based on data. So the process is, what did you do and for whom? So there's your story. Here's the population. This is what we did. This is evidence that something happened. How did we do it? How much time did it take? How many people participated? Did it follow a prescribed practice? Okay. And this is basically a sentence in the story. What do other people know, think, or can demonstrate as a result of this? How did students change? A competency changed. They perceived something. They learned a different skill set. They reduced their anxiety. They increased something or they reduced something. Okay? What were the results? Proof that it positively impacted students, and the reason you believe that you could impact more students in the future by doing the same or actually tweaking or improving your program. Take a look at the kinds of data that we're talking about here, the results or outcomes data. Simple statements, percentages, raw data, data over change. Okay? So anecdotes are data too. They're just not numerical data, they're qualitative data. They're effective when they're specific, when they identify the before, during, and after. What was the situation like before for that child or that group of students? What did you do, and how did it change them? It's current. Don't talk about anecdotes from 10 years ago, because that doesn't fit the situation today. Students are different, the landscape is different, what we're able to do is different, and frankly, we know more than we used to. Put a face on what you're trying to achieve. Okay? And understand that anecdotes are not war stories. It's not about whining and complaining. It's not about talking about how hard you work to help kids. It's not about making people feel emotionally engaged with this. It's not about making people feel guilty because they didn't give you what you needed before. It's designed to show how you can be effective and put a face on the larger story. If you want to learn how to use data, there's a couple of good resources that are here in terms of using how to talk about numbers, using media, and using statistics in ways that are persuasive and honest. So let's think about a model for the advocacy process that we're going to talk about. And I've developed this from looking at a number of published models for school counselors, but make sure you have a professional identity that you see as assertive and identifying yourself as a problem solver at the policy level. Develop the relationships that you need to do. Developing the relationship when the problem emerges probably will not be effective. Developing a relationship with policymakers in advance of problems means that when you call, they know who you are, you have credibility, and that you can get an ear much easier. It makes it much easier to tell your story. Define the problem based on data and set a reasonable goal or target for what the change will be. Develop clear and specific solutions and action plans that get you to your goal. So I'm not the only one who's going to be advocating this particular position. I have to look at who is interested in this. It may be the PTA. It may be some of the teachers in a particular department or in a particular grade level who have an interest in helping you make this change. Understand that you have to use collaborative resources and you have to stick with what is the common goal. Implement an action plan. Use good communication, collaboration, dispute resolution skills. Monitor what's going on and try and see if you need to make any changes as you move through the process. Evaluate your effectiveness, celebrate if you're not successful, and regroup if you're not. Remember that you're choosing goals based on data. They're probably good goals, and you need to stay with them for a while. You may need to regroup or rethink how you've approached it. But you need to stay with those goals if they were worth going after to begin with. In terms of system change, which is a little different than individual change or change at the school level for one student or a small group of students, again, develop a good goal based on data. It should have a sense of benefits and projected outcomes for making the change. Make sure your relationships are already intact and understand the risks and costs involved in change. Nobody's going to make change when they see it taking something away from themselves and not adding something more important that they need. Reach out, collaborate, manage those relationships, develop an advocacy strategy that's aimed at stakeholders and policymakers both. Start small and build up and out. Okay, start at your school, start with a grade level, and then keep building. So some examples. An individual student needs an exception to a rule, a special placement, a change in circumstance or environment. What's the desired outcome and who can make it happen? Usually in a building, that's probably the assistant principal or a principal. It may be a department chair. Build your case based on data for why, including learning what works for the next student so that you can maybe begin to not just make exceptions, but change policies when they're worth changing. Plan potential partners, implement your plan, and again, evaluate, reform, and reframe. Is there something we can learn for other students from this? Is this really not just a student exception or a policy change? For a group of students, if students are being systematically placed into less challenging classes because there's a rigid teacher recommendation process, identify data based on disaggregation, identify the exceptions of success, the incentives in law and public opinion for making the change. Identify some stakeholders who can share with you how to make this work. Develop a pilot program with a couple of faculty who are willing to work with you or with one department so that you can show how this begins to change. Remember what I said, start small. Evaluate, expand what worked, tinker with what didn't. So I want to share with you a fairly recent example. This is probably about 4 or 5 years old now, from Washington State in one school. The school counseling team asked for an additional career center staff. They had 1,800 students. They had 28 hours a week for career center support. The larger strategic plan, their real goal was to improve college and career readiness. Their method was to improve the number of hours there. So think about the larger goal. Their goal was to add 5 hours a week of additional career center support. Now that doesn't sound like much, but it's increasing career center support by almost 20%. So that's a significant increase. And all of us know that finding 5 hours consistently in a week is almost impossible unless you're deliberate about it, unless you can be planful about it. So the first step was one counselor worked with the administration on budget issues and how the additional hours would provide college and career readiness support for low achieving and at-risk students. And they did that by building data. Once the principals started to buy in, they worked with the district's career and tech ed director to try and secure funding and additional readiness programs for the position. Again, using data and again showing how it would benefit the district to have these increased outcomes. So they talked about caseloads. They talked about equity among the high schools. They talked about the outcomes in the high schools where they had equity. Okay. And they talked about how they could look at improving their position vis-a-vis how the other schools had done it. So here's some comparative data. Okay. The results data that was linked in part to a lack of counselor connection was the rise in the number of credit deficient students and a decrease in the number of on-time graduates. So they were able to look at, over a period of years, as their caseloads went up, their outcomes decreased. It was a one-on-one relationship. They presented it. They went to the school site team. They found a champion in the school site-based team, so they had a partner among the stakeholders, and they went to the school board. And they did, after a period of time, hired a 5th counseling position. So think about the data that you need to be observant and prepared to analyze and present to be an effective advocate. It's everywhere around you. You're immersed in data, you're just not necessarily collecting it. So the kinds of data that we typically work with as school counselors are achievement data, whether it be state, national, test scores, enrollment data, particularly important in middle school and high school where we begin to see students start to split off depending on how they're being identified. And those splits are very important. Graduation rate, and we can disaggregate that data in particular. Attendance data, discipline data, GPA data, retention rates, how many students are not graduating on time, dropout rates, stated reasons why students are dropping out, special education attention and classifications, and how those students are being identified and served. And stick to the basics. Look at attendance, look at discipline or school safety indicators, look at the indicators of academic achievement. Those are the areas that we can impact. So present raw data before and after. 20 students participated in this program, of whom 18 did well. After we intervened, 40 students participated in this program, of which 36 did well. Percentage data. Are some groups overrepresented, like dropouts? Are people who have changed schools more than 3 times in the last 5 years a higher percentage of the students who drop out than people who have been in the same school all along? That's where percentage data becomes meaningful. Percentage relative to a larger group over time, pre- and post-treatment or intervention, and you can use percentages meaningfully for increases and decreases in performance. Before the intervention, 43% of the students completed their homework on time. After the intervention, 75% of the students completed their homework on time, which is about an 80% increase in performance. Present averages. Sometimes the raw data is not meaningful, but what the average students are doing in a large group. Capture the data into a story. Talk about it as I've outlined it before. What's the problem? What's the intervention? What's the outcome? What did you do in that intervention to get that outcome? How many more students could be impacted by this? How have changes occurred over time? Put it in a chart. Use writing and media. Use a school counseling performance report card or a multimedia presentation. There's a lot of advantages to using multimedia presentations because you can do a self-narrated PowerPoint that runs for 5 minutes that you can send a link to everybody in your school, to everybody on the school board. It tells a quick story and it puts a specific face on what you're trying to accomplish in terms of larger policy change. Don't be afraid to use charts, tables, and figures, but use them sparingly and meaningfully. Don't drown people in data. Show the one chart or the two charts that will show the difference that you've made. Use available technology, and there's a lot of it to collect, analyze, and present data. Get comfortable with Excel. Get comfortable with Google Docs. Get comfortable with using Google Forms to collect data. You can dump that into Excel, and whether you use Easy Analyze or you use Excel statistics themselves, that's all the technology that you will need to create a PowerPoint, to tell a story, to create a chart, to do the data analysis that's required for this. We're talking about keeping it simple. Nobody has to have a PhD in statistics to really do a good job using data to tell their story. So collect and share data stories. Every time you hear an anecdote about a school counseling success, collect it, whether it be about an individual student or a group of students. Ask colleagues to write down brief descriptions of what they're doing and what's working and the outcomes that verify it. Begin to assemble school counseling success stories that you can tell in a few sentences. I intervened with a small group of students last year, and that group of students was headed down direction X, and instead they are now heading down direction Y. Tell the stories in ways that prompt people to ask you, how did you do that? What would it take for you to do more of it? Share the sparks. Close the gap projects, newsletters, in person. And get involved with policymakers at all levels, and do this in advance. Tell people good news before you ask them for something. Go to the school level for day-to-day policy. Go to the district for those that impact students and counselors on a more broad basis. Go to the state for things that impact the profession and its ability to help students. Another example. This is an advocacy example at the policymaker level for the profession. There's a legislative task force that's considering saving money by shifting non-counseling jobs to counselors. This is we know this is a realistic activity because we know it's happened at the school level, at the district level, and in fact at the legislative level. So develop two pictures. What's the model and the possibilities when you have school counseling doing what it's supposed to do, and what are the potential outcomes for the schools and students if that's implemented. Ask about current data, how the outcomes will change with less school counseling time, smaller school counseling program, and what are the possibilities for increasing student achievement that will not be possible if you engage in this particular activity. Collaborate early, collaborate before you need people. Collaborate with other people to try and problem solve. Find out what's their take on it. Reframe it. Settle on an approach that everybody can believe in, and don't wait for an all-purpose perfect solution. There will never be one. These solutions get built over time by expanding from small to bigger. The other thing about collaboration, and this is very important if you feel like you're an advocate but that you're a lonely voice, is that collaboration prevents burnout. You have a group of like-minded people with whom to share thoughts. You can offload some of the burden of being an advocate You can develop new strategies, you can reach more people, and that is something that actually multiplies. Then begin moving forward. Reach out to your partners when you have something that you need to reach out for them. Get to your technology, flesh out a plan, match your activities to the resources. Don't take on a statewide project when there's 3 of you interested in doing it. First, you're going to have to get a larger group to do that. Develop a plan and the materials that you need to tell your story. Develop a communication strategy. Engage more constituents and the public to your side so that this is a message that spreads.
Maddie, I have a quick question that's popped up. Maddie,
sure.
I've got a question here. Somebody's asking Dr. Isaacs, how do you recommend graduate school counseling students get involved and forge advocacy relationships at the district and state level?
That's a perfect question, because the time to get involved is to start identifying yourself as somebody who is a graduate student in school counseling to your district. Send all the school board members an introduction to you. Congratulate them on something they did that you think was a decent decision. Send a note to your constituents after an election. After the school board gets elected, send them a congratulation note. Hello, congratulations on getting elected. I appreciate your willingness to step forward and help our students and our school students in our district advance and do a better job, okay, improving achievement and caring about kids. I care about students too. I'm a future school counselor. I'm a current teacher in your district. I'm going to be communicating with you over time to help you think about issues that are important. Okay? That's a perfect way to begin to identify yourself. Find something that you can congratulate them. Go visit them. Stop by their office when they're in the district. What many people don't realize is that legislators respond enormously to constituents, and they will respond better to you when you're not going to them to complain about a specific issue. Start off by going to them to introduce yourself. A couple of times I've been on the Hill representing higher education and representing school counselors, and I've stopped by not because I had a bill I wanted them to vote on, just to introduce myself and to say, I live in your district and I work in your broader district. I work for the university and I'm engaged in K through post-secondary education and training. I care about these issues, X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to be staying in touch with you about these issues. That's all I've said. I haven't told them they're doing anything wrong. I haven't told them what the problems are. I've just told them what I care about. When I send an email asking for an appointment when there is an issue I care about, later on, I get an immediate response and I get an appointment. Legislators are only up in Tallahassee in Florida every other week during the session. That means that they are in their districts on alternate weeks. You can get 5 to 10 minutes of their time in their office for one or more of you to just go and meet them. Identify yourself. Find something out about them that you can relate to, that you can talk about for a few minutes. That's how school counseling graduate students can get involved. You get involved as a voter and a citizen. It happens to be that you are a student or a teacher or engaged in studying and caring about students and education in a particular way. I hope that answered the question. Russ, is there anything else? Any other questions coming through? Okay, then let's go back to this. So once you have established yourself with people who are in policy-making decisions, you can then begin to talk to them about what you see as a vision, what they might think about doing as they consider different bills, how they might impact outcomes by making different decisions, by advocating for different positions. If you don't have the luxury of doing that before an important issue comes up, certainly don't hesitate to contact your legislators anyway. And that's to say, I am a voter in your district, or I'm an employee in a school district that you care about and that you represent, and I want you to think about these issues as you're voting on the budget. I want you to think about these issues as you approve the new pupil progression bill, as you approve new career goals, as you approve X, Y, and Z. Have a tight focus and a targeted argument. Do not try and engage them about every possible issue and every possible reason they should support you. Make it tight. They're going to listen to 1 or 2 minutes of what you have to say, and they're going to hear you in sound bites, because that's what's going to stick with them. If you overwhelm them with information, even if it's good information, when you're trying to give them a report, a verbal report especially, they're going to stop reading or they're not going to take it in. So you can provide them with backup if they ask for it, but give them targeted, focused goal statements and arguments. Try and use solution-focused strategies to problem solve. Detailed action plans based on what has worked before, rather than assuming that anything that you plan is going to work. Okay? Try and take divergent perspectives on problems and solutions that lead to effective action planning and problem solving. So get to your stakeholders. What other things could we do? Some of them may not be the solution you have in mind, but may accrue to a good solution for your goal, your targets. Focus on the strengths and solutions and change rather than on the difficulties. There's going to be plenty of people who are policymakers who have made some boneheaded moves in your view in the past. They voted for things that you didn't agree with, that you think did damage. That's not where to focus. Try and find things that they've done that you supported. That's where they're going to want to hear from you. That's where they're going to want to think that you're like-minded. Have a very clear picture of where you're going in order to ensure that you're going to get where you think you're going, and build in accountability. Talk to them about what you're going to be able to report to them next year if they take this action this year. What kinds of changes are you willing to commit to? What are you willing to commit to doing if they're willing to commit to support your change? So advocacy is about change. It may start with you and your methods. Remember the solution-focused notion that if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten. If you're wondering why you haven't been effective in advocacy before, start looking at the methods that you've used. Have you had targeted goals? Have you looked at data and outcomes? Have you committed yourself to do something different? If you're going to ask other people to make that commitment, you need to start with you. Be the model for what you want to achieve. Accept that change is the status quo. Be prepared for it. Be willing to learn and implement new ways of doing business. Don't be afraid of change. The hardest thing to do is to go to a legislator and say, don't make that change because I don't want to change. I like things the way it used to be. That's not a very good argument. You go to them and say, if you make this change, this will be lost, this will be impacted. These are the reasons of things that will disappear. Are you willing to make the change to get something new, to lose the things that will disappear? But not just because we want to hold on to what used to be there. Things are always going to change. There's always going to be new conditions. Somebody is always going to think they have a better idea. And unfortunately or fortunately, we are always going to be the recipients of change that we think sometimes is well-advised, sometimes is ill-advised. Be prepared for it. Be reflective and examine your goals. Do the right things for right and responsible reasons. Examine your attitudes and values, because those are the things that are going to drive your behavior. Challenge yourself beyond your own limits and be accountable. Hold yourself accountable. In order to be a strong advocate, you have to be prepared to lead. And leadership is an issue that has been one that's in conversation for school counselors for a long time. If we want to be at the leadership table, we have to show ourselves as having leadership skills. Show that you have a strong program. Lead from your strengths. Lead from the things that you've done well. Take actions that are assertive, that support students, that talk about doing something that doesn't just have to do with the school counselor's job, but is tied directly to student success and students' actions. Advocacy also engages in sometimes taking risks. And risk-taking can be very frightening when you're thinking about changing the status quo or pointing out to policymakers that in the vernacular of the old story that sometimes the emperor is naked. And sometimes we have to take the risk to find a positive way of telling people that naked may not be their most attractive outfit. Try and use good cognitive behavioral skills to not personalize defeat and not personalize disagreements. Remember that advocacy is professional activity, even when it's something we care deeply about, or a student that we care deeply about, or a group we may care deeply about. It isn't personal. This is business. You have to be able to set boundaries and separate business from the professional. Reframe personal failure into one of, I didn't have the right skills, I can learn those skills. They may not have been deployed appropriately or at the right time. Maybe I didn't plan well. Those are all things that are fixable. What can I learn from a good best effort? Sometimes advocacy is a series of successive approximations until we get it right. We get small bites at the apple until we get the whole apple eaten. It could be a growth experience. It could be a successful start. So you need to begin to reframe so that this does not become more of a barrier for you or more depressing and overwhelming when you don't get what you set out to achieve. Remember that it starts and ends with student achievement, and student achievement will start and end with what you can do as a counselor. No one else is going to advocate for school counseling if they don't advocate for themselves. Nobody else is going to point a light and shine a light on a successful school counseling program if we don't do that. And no one is going to advocate for school counselors harder than we will. Why should they? Everybody has lots of things that are important to them, so we have to take this on ourselves. So I want to give you some advice about extending your reach, in particular in working with legislators, because often school counselors are pretty good in their buildings. They may get themselves up to talk with school board members or district people, but working with legislators, my experience is many of them feel that's too distant or too much at a higher level for them to reach for. So develop your relationships early. Do it before the session gets underway, when they're in the midst of bills and emails and everything flying back and forth. In the period when they're doing legislative planning is a good time to get to know people. As I said, right, maybe right after the recent election and before the session starts, as people are preparing to get sworn in. Introduce yourself at every opportunity. Hand out your business card like candy at Halloween. Have a lot of them printed. Always have extras. Invite public officials, local or state, to any big programs or conversations so that they can take photos. Having photos with people, having them actually see a program in impact. They love it because it shows that they've been involved at the local level. You'll love it because they'll remember who you are and they're going to know what your school can do. Watch for a district day, the day that legislators set aside time to actually be with their own constituency. Okay? If you happen to be passing through Tallahassee when they're in session, stop by for an hour and call a week in advance and tell them you're going to be on the Hill on this day at this time. You'd like to come in and shake their hand. Legislators love that. Concentrate on principles of policy rather than specifics. Trust that your everyday professional advocates know the details. Your job is to set the stage with your elected officials, to improve access for other advocates sometimes. Make the hometown connection. Listen to them. You want them to listen with both their ears. So you want to be a constituent, you want to be a voter, you want to care about certain issues. Bring facts rather than opinions. Don't try and sway them by pulling their heartstrings. Everybody does. When I've been on the Hill recently, we started to talk to them, and one of my colleagues who was with me started to say, well, you know, you need to do this because it's the right thing to do, and because if you don't, you're going to pay a heavy price. And they started to laugh, and they said, you know that every single person who comes in here says the same thing. Have some facts, have some salient facts that you can do, and have data. Don't just give them idle threats. Provide them with written summaries, a single page that you can leave behind with your message and key points. Don't give them every piece of data you have, a one-page statement. What you think the problem is, how it can be solved legislatively, what the outcome will be. If you can't get to your legislator, learn to work with their staff. They are key people, and their legislators rely on staff more and more, especially freshman legislators who may be working with staff who have been on the Hill for 20 years, working for prior legislators. And with term limits, staff often have more knowledge and more influence than the legislator themselves. Don't be afraid to make phone calls. Don't be afraid to use emails. When people's email and phones light up, believe me, they start to pay attention. Leave a message with a legislative assistant to get it delivered to the lawmaker office. They will get back to you very quickly. If you can't get to the legislator, get to their aid. Send letters to people in a specific address. Send something short. State your case. If it has to do with proposed legislation, refer to it by bill number. Ask them to vote yes or no and explain why. Again, 2 or 3 paragraphs. Even if you're using a form letter that's been provided by a local advocacy group, try and personalize it just a little bit so they can know that this is you asking for this. If you want them to reply, make sure you ask for a reply. Ask for an opportunity for them to call you, that you'd like to talk to them for 5 minutes about this issue. Stay on with more personal contact. At the end of the session, send them a note congratulating them on the end of the session, thanking them for whatever support they were able to garner, and remind them that you're going to be staying on the issues that you think are important and that you hope that they will remember that those issues are important for the next session. Learn how to track a bill. Affiliate with professional organizations that will help you track bills or will send out legislative alerts. And some last thoughts. Advocacy is about long-term processes and long-term relationships. Sometimes it takes a long time to get rolling. Sometimes it takes a long time to get any or all of your goals accomplished. But always keep your eyes on the prize. It's focused. It's in the art of compromise. We don't expect everything, but we strive for as much unanimity as we can, and we try and work for the majority of what we can get. There is strength in diversity. There's always power in having common goals. Try and bring as many diverse voices to your cause as possible, and recognize the political realities. Some legislators are simply not going to agree with your positions. Expect it. It's healthy in our government system to have diverse positions. Try and avoid confrontation. Try to find common grounds or interests. Always be respectful, but be firm and hold your position. Your common areas will be of use when you're trying to reach compromise. Go back to Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world, because that's how it's always started. Any successful advocacy effort you see on the Hill is coming from 1 or 2 people who started maybe this year, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, to try and get the change that they think is really important. So again, here's a review of your advocacy steps, single fact sheets, understand multiple audiences, understand multiple perspectives, try and have some points that are important to the message, develop a campaign, build a website, use technology, build evaluation into your work, because you're going to always want to regroup and reframe. here are some references about advocacy.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time. I know we're going to get kicked off here in just a few seconds. So I want to thank Dr. Isaacs, who, by the way, is also the Florida School Counselor Association past president and our current advocacy chair. She has done some wonderful work in this area. Thank you, Dr. Isaacs. We really appreciate that. And thank you all for coming. This webinar was brought to you by the Florida School Counselor Association. If you're not yet a member, please visit www.fla-schoolcounselor.org and do that. It only takes a minute or two. And happy National School Counseling Week.